I can hardly believe what I'm about to say, but here goes. Welcome to the final closing plenary of the 2022 SDG Action Zone. It's been an inspiring 3 days, and today's climate conversations have left me feeling totally energized. From our hopes and targets for COP27 to Indigenous-led solutions, from the transformative potential of the fashion industry to building green and blue economies, we've covered a lot of ground. It's not over yet, though. We still have our Ask Away session with today's speakers, as well as a sit down between Deputy Secretary General Amina J. Mohammed and Hugh Evans, co-founder and CEO of Global Citizen. And if you've joined the SDG Action Zone before, you know we won't say goodbye without a very special performance to close the show. So make sure you're here for all of that. But first, the plenary. 3 young climate activists are joining us to reflect on the lessons of the day and explore how we can turn them into concrete action. Opening the lineup is a 20-year-old Mexican climate activist and member of the indigenous Otomi Toltec Nation. She experienced the climate crisis firsthand at 13 when extreme flooding forced her family to move to New York City. But it only took a few short years for her to fight back in a major way. She became a major organizer of Fridays for Future NYC in 2019. And in 2020, she co-founded the Re-Earth Initiative and began pursuing an environmental studies degree at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us, Shia Bastida. Next, we have a leading voice for Black and Indigenous visibility in climate activism, who also happens to be a member of US President Joe Biden's White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and an emerging technology developer. One of the major organizers of Fridays for Future Washington, he first gained international recognition for being the first consecutive climate striker in Washington, D.C. And today he is, among so many other things, the founder of 1 Million of Us, an international nonprofit youth voting and advocacy organization. It's great to have you here, Jerome Foster II. Finally, we welcome an Iranian-American environmentalist studying climate science and public policy at Stanford University. She's the founder and executive director of Climate Cardinals, an international youth-led nonprofit working with some 6,000 volunteers to translate and source vital climate information into more than 100 languages. And in addition to those formidable efforts to make the climate movement more accessible, she also represents the US as the youngest member of the United Nations Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Welcome, welcome, Sophia Kiani. So let's get to it. Climate change is such an essential part of your generation's value system. Why do you think that is? And how do we translate that intensity into action? Why don't we start with you, Shia?
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for that great introduction. We're so excited to be here. I think one of the reasons why it's so important for my generation is because we have grown up with climate disasters, not just with pollution, not just with some economic systems that don't work for the global south, but we have seen it in our own countries, in our own cities. And I don't think in a few years' time, there's going to be a single person in the world who hasn't seen a climate disaster. And this shouldn't be the case. But this energy, we're not pessimistic about it. We're optimistic about our ability to communicate the urgency and make people realize that my generation doesn't want to be scared of the future. So we think that our voices are essential because we're stakeholders of that future. We're going to be the ones alive in the future that politicians are negotiating right now. And they seem to forget that I am going to be 48 in 2050. It's not abstract for me, it's my life. So we want to bring that energy and we want to bring that passion and we want to bring those solutions to the climate policies locally and internationally.
I love that you have done that math because I think that puts it into really stark relief. Jerome, what about you? Do you want to weigh in on that one?
I think it is incredibly crucial, especially when talking about translating this into action, because right now we're facing the 6th mass extinction and we're having an unprecedented crisis everywhere across our planet. And for us to really understand the urgency of this, we have to make sure that equity and justice are at the center of these conversations. When it comes to COP27, loss and damage funds, to make sure that we have $100 billion to frontline communities, we have to make sure that we're putting the face to these numbers and a face to the children that are drowning and burning because of the profits that fossil fuel CEOs are perpetuating. Right now, young people are seen in so many spaces, in the United Nations, in the White House, on the streets, and in the voting booths. We're a powerful and united political force, and we've been here for so long. And this action is going to come from them understanding that youth are a metaphor of the future. Every time they look at my generation, we're going to be the people inheriting this earth. And we have to learn to live within the boundaries of nature and be stewards to it, and not use an economic system of capitalism to continue to exploit it and exploit Indigenous and Black and so many cultures that has been happening for so many hundreds of years.
Youth as a metaphor is a beautiful idea because it's continuous, right? This notion that anytime you're looking down the chain, so to speak, at young people, it should be energizing as a leader and as an older person, because the idea is that's who you're working for, and working toward building a better world. Sophia, what about you?
I completely agree with what both of you shared. And I think that this idea that this is the world that we're going to be inheriting is so real for young people, because we've grown up and we've seen that the climate crisis firsthand is impacting our generation in a way no other generation has ever seen before. The Washington Post a year ago said that we're experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis and climate change weather-induced disasters at a rate 3 times higher than our grandparents. And we can see that with flooding on the coastlines, with wildfires in California. And so for our generation, this is something that's very clear, it's very now. And I think part of the urgency comes from the fact, I mean, I'm 20. A few years ago, I couldn't even vote. I felt like I couldn't share my voice and have a tangible impact the way that I wanted to. And I think that because of that, that's why we've been so drawn to the idea of grassroots organizing, getting into the streets, making our voices heard, because we don't want to feel paralyzed by climate anxiety and to think that this is a crisis that we're inheriting that we can't do anything about. So I think that Gen Zers are so motivated, we want to make change happen, and we're willing to pursue all these different avenues, use social media, and get our voices heard.
It makes perfect sense. And you're also seeing it in a way we've never seen before, not just because of the intensity and the volume, but also because of the way our social media and media in general works now, which makes it even more stark. Shia, I want to come to you around this idea of mindset, because in the past, we had this notion that Indigenous communities in particular had a real focus on Mother Earth and keeping things in balance. And to some extent, that was a bit of fetishization. But the reality is we've gone completely the opposite way. And so do you have thoughts on how we might reintroduce that mindset so that the notion of balance and actually stewardship of the planet and the people becomes a bigger focus than just comfort and convenience and some of the things that have maybe been foregrounded in more recent years?
100%. And I think this is what the Sustainable Development Goals wanted to do, reintroduce that mindset and redefine development. Because for Indigenous communities, development is actually pollution, destruction of our ecosystems. It's not the, the solution maker of everything. Yeah. And we have to understand that for us, development actually means the erosion of ecosystems. So we have to be able to redefine that and say, how do we have a development that is a development of the self, a development of communities, a development of cooperation and interconnection? And that's where Indigenous knowledge and wisdom comes in. And it's something that I think the whole world has to adopt. The ideas of reciprocity. We have to live in a world where if we take, we have to give back. We have to live in a world where we live by the 7-generation principle and not only care about the next quarter or the next election, but the 7 generations around us. All of these things, I think, are what makes you feel that your purpose is actually to take care of Mother Earth. And that is my purpose. My purpose is not to become a billionaire and buy an island. My purpose is to make this world livable for my children as much as it was for my grandparents. And that type of mindset of shifting your mindset from what you think our goals as humanity should be, shifts your perspective towards, I am here to be part of building something beautiful, something nurturing, and protecting the joy of communities, not exposing them to pollution, exploitation, and disasters.
You can see I'm snapping because I don't want to talk over your audio, but I'm like, all of that makes, again, such intuitive sense. And yet it's not the way that we're approaching things the majority of the time. And so Jerome, I want to go to you now as a sort of follow on to this. We've really gone away from linking this notion of, say, civil rights with climate change. And yet we know that the people who are most affected by climate change's harms are often the people who traditionally are the most vulnerable. And so how do we relink those things, one, and two, actually make people up and down the so-called ladder feel some sense of responsibility for everyone, whether it is they're in those categories, so to speak, or not?
Absolutely. I think that when we talk about how do we relink and reconnect with what we should be doing to the planet, we have to think about how we got here in the first place. The climate crisis started with the mindset of colonialism and extraction. It started with the mindset of continuing to exploit limitlessly for just the richest few people, while the majority of folks are suffering at the hand of capitalism. And I think that right now, the solutions that we see are embedded in making sure that we have equity and making sure that we have policies that go beyond just net zero or these terms that only change the margins of what we want. We have to get to the roots of them. That starts with reframing how we see countries and how we give out international aid. With so much of what's happening right now, we see policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, which started from the roots of the Green New Deal, which had large-scale mobilization in the next 10 years to get to 0% emissions. And right now, with bills like the Inflation Reduction Act, they're a great, ambitious step to get us almost there, but we have that next step to take where we look at the way in which we implement. We can have all these promises at COP27, at COP28, or at these G7 conferences, but it's how we make sure that the money goes to communities. The biggest issue that we're seeing across the country across the world right now is that when we have money that is even allocated to restoration and development in the sense that Shia was talking about, it oftentimes has environmental racism, environmental sexism, and homophobia linked to it, where it doesn't reach the communities that need it right now. That is how we have to reframe and reach that future that we want to see.
And that's assuming it reaches at all, because that's something, it's almost like, that accountability piece is crucial as well. Sophia, I'd love to talk a little bit about who the climate movement and movements in general leave out, because one of the beautiful things about your work is this idea that it's not just let's be inclusive as a headline, but actually making the work itself more inclusive by making it accessible to people. So who do you feel movements are leaving behind, and how do we take other initiatives like yours to make sure that that doesn't happen and to include everybody in causes that affect them directly?
Well, I think when it comes to the climate movement, for so long, this space has been very white, very old, and usually very male. And I think that usually it doesn't make any sense, because when you think about who is being disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, it's people on the front lines, people of color, women. Women are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. 80% of climate refugees are women. And so when we're thinking about these communities that are being impacted by the climate crisis, why should they not be the ones who are also leading on developing solutions? Ultimately, if you're the one whose community is being impacted, then you should have a very heavy representation at the decision-making table when it comes to actually determining how those solutions are going to be implemented. And I think that's why we put such a big emphasis on funding a just transition. So when we're displacing people out of like fossil fuel jobs, we're then directing them into the clean energy sector, reskilling and upskilling workers so that they feel prepared for this new clean energy transition. And with the case of climate cardinals, I mean, after I learned that 80% of scientific research was only available in English, the 61 languages account for less than half of the world's speaking population, it became very clear that all of this climate literature we were putting out was only available in English, and we were leaving so much of the world behind. And so I think that efforts like mine are, again, another example of how young people continually innovate. And we want to make sure that this voice, this movement is as representative of our living rooms and of the people that we work with every single day.
And that's not just a challenge to inclusiveness, it's a challenge to success. It makes it harder for us to achieve the goals. And maybe that's a good place for us to go now, because you all make us all optimistic. I mean, you're all in school, and yet you've had activism careers that really rival most people's lifetimes of work. And yet I think you've probably had pretty extensive experience of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to actually achieving our goals with respect to climate and all the SDGs. So when you reflect on that, what do you think the biggest roadblocks are to us achieving these goals? And what are your thoughts on how we actually overcome those? I'm happy for anyone to jump in here who's got some big thoughts on challenges. Shia, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I was just going to say that the reason why things haven't worked is because there's been stories and people who have been missing out of the spaces. So how can, for example, the UN be a place for all people when not all people are at the decision-making table? The solutions are not going to work for everyone because you're not hearing people's perspectives at the ground. So I think our challenge on inclusion has been the fact that there are so many systemic blocks as to how people can be present in these tables. And one of them is language, for sure. I know, like, I had to learn English forcefully, like, because I had no other option when I moved to the US. But usually the kids who know English from international countries are kids who have access to that English education, which is very, very expensive and hard to get. Another thing is, for example, COP27 is in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is one of the most expensive cities in Egypt. Civil society cannot go. It's very hard for even like people who work at the UN or at the White House, for example, to even make it there. So I think that when we think of building the world that works for everyone, we have to think of the systems that include everyone. And that is hard. And we've been fighting that for 60 years in the environmental movement, but it's something that my generation is keen to break down, like all of the barriers. And I can go to any single country in the world and find a climate activist that I can, stay with or meet up with. And that type of international solidarity and international collection is something that will take us to the next level of representation and inclusion.
Absolutely. I love how good at this that you guys are, that you're managing each other's schedules. It actually does give me hope for the entire future. But Sophia, now jump in on the question of challenges.
Yeah, of course. I think that definitely I agree that a huge challenge is, of course, accessibility and inclusion. And I think that beyond that, when you look even at the state of philanthropy, only 2% of philanthropy actually goes towards climate. So I do think that I've heard from so many climate scientists that we're so fixated on these new technologies like carbon capture. And instead of focusing on the fact that we have solutions that are available to us, like nature-based solutions that are scalable and proven to work, but it's just in a lot of senses a matter of a crisis of funding, where we don't have the resources available to actually implement the solutions that scientists say that we need to. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so important for us to push as grassroots organizers and to make sure that we're getting climate legislation and climate policy passed that's progressive and actually allocates money towards getting these climate solutions implemented. And I do want to harp on the point that Shay brought up in the sense that I think the climate activist community is so incredible, and we've done such a good job of mobilizing resources and sharing them. And I think it's amazing, like Shay and Jerome and I have all crossed paths so many times and been able to speak on different panels and stuff together. And we've created this amazing community. And I think that's really what we need to lead with, is a sense of community and working together to pool resources, to pool ideas, because I think that together we can actually make a difference.
I love everything that you've just said. Jerome, if you'll hold with me for 1 second, we're losing Shia to actual class, but I wanted to get you on the record for 10 seconds. What makes you hopeful? What does success look like? What are you looking for to happen in the future that will let you know that we're on the right path? Just quickly, before you go to music.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. And what makes me hopeful is the people in every single industry who are leading change, because we know that we are in this start of a new era. And I think all of us are embracing that. It's not just my generation who knows we have to change everything, but every single person who is alive today knows that we are in this era of change. I want our generation to be the last one to be dependent on fossil fuels. I want our generation to be the first of so many that is redefining the economic, political, socioeconomic system. And I think we have to do it because we have no other option. So that's why I'm hopeful. And it was just it's awesome that I get to do this work with amazing activists like Jerome and Sophia.
It's awesome. Have a great class. And we'll come back to you, Jerome. So I'd love to hear what you're hopeful on as well, but also your previous answer, which you were so gracious to hold on to till we sent you off to class.
Yeah, I think that especially when the past couple of days I've been within White House meetings and within the WEJAC Environmental Justice Advisory Council, talking about how do we actually implement this and the solutions that we need. A lot of the issue that stops a lot of progress right now is making sure that people are aware of the ways in which they can make impact and the ways in which they can build infrastructure. Right now, we see in Jackson, Mississippi, the issue is of implementation, of the fact that they have access to federal grants now because of the Inflation Reduction Act and other bills that are like that. But also, I think there's a large gap and understanding that all across the world, we have to not only look out for our national communities, but also communities that aren't legally recognized, like Indigenous people in all across California and Alaska and Puerto Rico, who have no access to climate grants because of the fact that of the way our political system is set up. And we have to make sure that we, in this next phase, in the next 10 years of massive scale that we need, we have to radically rethink how we function as a society and as a people. Right now, our world is on a record rate to destabilize and have catastrophic climate disasters everywhere. And we can't just continue to think about in these conferences, how do we make sure that capitalism is less worse and less worse, but think about new ways in which we can actually work with people and work in new systems in which youth are inherently a part of these conversations, in which scientists are in councils, and every 4 years we don't have new administrations that derail progress. We have to be on a mindset of unity, on a mindset of urgency when we talk about climate action, because it isn't a political issue. It isn't a polarizing issue. It's a human and equity issue. It's an issue of making sure that refugees and homeless LGBTQ youth and Black and brown people have access to shelter, water, and clean air. And that's the basic rights we should all have access to.
100%. And I shouldn't laugh, but I mean, honestly, that's a scathing grammatical indictment against what's happening right now. Less worse should not be our baseline or our goal. So just quickly, 10 seconds, Jerome, what makes you hopeful?
I think this makes me hopeful. It's having conversations like this. It's the people that are here, like you and Sophie Kiani and Shie, who are tirelessly doing this work and making sure that people understand that climate action is something that we need to be talking about, and that is intersections with so many other movements.
It's a must. And Sophia, last word on that, hope.
Young people, Jerome, Shie, all these incredible activists I work with every day, the students I attend school with at Stanford, these are the people who I know are going to fix this world.
I couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you to all three of you. This has been incredible. We're going to see a lot more of you, I hope and I know. And thank you to everybody out there from the SDG Action Zone. We'll see you on the other side.